I went to the largest show for headphones and personal audio in the world. CanJam Global will next year have 8 shows across the world showcasing headphones, earphones and various types of personal audio, everything from desktop systems through to high-end portable audio. The largest of these shows is in Southern California at the Irvine Marriott in Los Angeles and fills the entire ballroom, all the surrounding rooms, as well as the rooms on the second floor. People might think of it as a trade show, but really it's a community show where companies and members of the Head-Fi community can check out audio gear that they are interested in buying, but more important, meet the owners of the companies, meet other enthusiasts and have a great time. Indeed, rather than a show full of large companies, it is primarily made up of small companies from single-person entities up to larger companies, often run by people who started in the community themselves. Not just the show itself, but with a hotel full of enthusiasts, you're always seeing groups of people sitting in the lobby or in the restaurant chatting or checking out portable gear and listening to IEMs, and you're always running into friends either in the lobby or the restaurant, if not in the show itself. These informal meets are so many and numerous that when I went down for breakfast on Friday morning, a day before the show at 8 AM, I didn't end up getting back to my room until midnight due to the great many people I ran into throughout the day, and that's just the day before the show. That being said, the show itself is so huge that I couldn't even begin to cover a fraction of the products available, or even just what's new. Unlike my previous show report from Singapore, I mostly covered headphones this time with a few pairs of in-ear monitors. The problem with covering IEMs is that there are now so many models available, I almost don't know where to begin. Whatever your taste in music, however, there will be a pair in both your budget and style available from one or another of the manufacturers to satisfy your needs. What is more, like I said before, most of these manufacturers are small and run by only a handful of people who started off as enthusiasts in the community. An example of that is Lee from Mysticraft, who started off reshelling IEMs and is now the maker of one of the most famous pair of IEMs available, the Hex. Those I reported on in the last show report in Singapore, and there were so many of my friends who now have a pair, even at the very high price of $10,000, that it was no trouble getting a listen to them again. However, his latest IEM is the new Myth, and it has 1 dynamic driver, 4 balanced armature drivers, and 2 microplanar drivers. Listening to those with a pair of ASLA Crystal 2 tips, and a cable that Lee said was not going to be the final one for the production version, Anwar Brahim's Stopover, via a friend's R2R player, had quite a warm sound with boomy bass. That admittedly can overwhelm the mids when listening to pop and rock music. The mid-range and treble quality, however, is excellent, if the overall sound signature is a bit warm for preference. However, they were definitely not fatiguing, unlike a lot of IEMs that I have tried where the treble is a little bit too bright. However, it doesn't quite manage the right timbre overall due to the strong bass. Listening to Dead Can Dance's Indus from the Hugo 2, rather than my friend's R2R player, the track came through powerfully, with more treble than I had experienced using my friend's player. That made the overall balance better considering the warm tuning, and with that the mid-range drums were quite prominent. Switching to some jazz from Hank Jones with the track Speak Low, the overall sound was quite warm, with a full sound stage for that jazz track, maybe with a bit more of a congested sound than I'm used to hearing from some higher end IEMs, but still with good instrument clarity, if the overall position of the instruments in the sound stage is a bit narrower than usual. Switching to something more well known, Massive Attack's Unfinished Sympathy ends up with a comical if detailed subwoofer-like bass. The detail with that track is quite good, only really let down by some congestion and that aforementioned narrower soundstage. But given that they are under $1,000, that makes them a good alternative to the typically brighter sounding IEMs that you get from many other manufacturers. To make it easy to evaluate gear, I brought with me a pair of Dan Clark Audio's Stealth headphones, as they are headphones with which I am both familiar and also closed back, making it easier for listening on a noisy show floor or in noisy rooms. To that end, one of the big things at the show was, of course, Schiit Audio's Biggie, the latest version of the Yggdrasil, which is a Sigma Delta DAC, completely custom designed by Schiit Audio. Schiit Audio had set up the Yggdrasil with a Mjolnir, and Jose Gonzalez sounded very dynamic through this setup. Likewise, La Luna by Rai Kuda had a lot of detail and dynamics at the same time. I thought they may well have a good sense of instrument individuality rather than a single coloration being applied, which is something which I find a lot of DACs have. However, the overall sound was somewhat deliberate sounding, very likely a characteristic of their proprietary digital filter. However, I do plan to get in the new Sigma Delta Iggy for a full review and compare it to my Yggdrasil analog too. A big surprise at the show was the presence of a new Jotunheim model, and here's Jason Stoddard to tell you all about that.
We've got Jason here for a new Jotunheim has appeared out of nowhere, a wild Jotunheim, and we have a wild Jason to explain it.
Yeah, and that was a big shock to actually all of us that Jotunheim 3 was ready for this show. This is a production run, it's hand assembled, and we'll be shipping them, I think we're claiming October 15th, that's probably about right. It probably comes down to whether or not we make the boards or someone else makes the boards, because it could actually go either way right now. But anyway, Jotunheim 3. Why did we do a 3? Well, I think I put in the chapter, one of the main reasons, one of the actual good criticisms of Jotunheim is that the single-ended performance was never quite up to the balanced performance of the amp. It was a little bit noisy. Distortion was, totally different as far as, single-ended versus balanced. So we wanted to address that. We also wanted to give you some more modern, connectivity. So it has a 4.4 jack, and it actually has this one here has the mesh card in it. So we now have a fork-bearded Jotunheim 3. We also improved the ventilation a bit, so because we're running it a lot hotter. It also uses our new Continuity A output stage. And we were talking about this, someone's like, was it Nexus? It's like, no, it's actually not Nexus. We have refined the output stage that we use in a lot of amps to the point where it's actually something very different. That's how we got balanced and single-ended to actually work and measure the same. I believe this is the best measuring amp we've ever done. It still only has 10 dB of overall feedback. It's still fully discrete, but it's very, very refined compared to what we've done in the past. So now you have something that you really can plug into anything. Works great with IEMs, works great with giant headphones. In fact, we got Modhouse tungstens on here just so people can see. Yes, it can drive these, no problem at all. It's a big, beefy, crazy amp. And it's still $500, $499 thing. I think that's the pitch.
One of the highlights of the show was the Audeze LCD S20 headphones. Raikuda's La Luna through these indicated that they have Audeze's house sound with the usual slight thickness, but with a much freer and quite resolving mid-range and treble. It felt like having detail without it being in your face, as can be had with some of their headphones. Both clear and mellow at the same time. Given that they are priced around the $500 mark, this is quite remarkable. Here's Peter to explain how they achieved that.
Hey, this is Peter from Audeze. We're here at CanJam SoCal 2025 talking about the new LCD S20 closed-back planar headphones. These feature our SLAM technology for the first time on a planar headphone. That is this series of grooves here around the inside of the outside of the headphone driver that, when sealed with the pad over the top, forms an acoustically tuned channel that basically selectively raises the lowest octave to really fill in the low bass on this headphone. But it also has the benefit of creating less of a pressure differential between the two sides of the planar driver, which means that the driver can basically move with greater ease, and that gives a greater sense of fine detail and spatial detail.
Heading over to the Bloom Audio room, I thought it a good opportunity to try some IEMs. I have to thank Dan from Bloom Audio for sponsoring this report once again and making it possible for me to attend the show. Dan has always collected a full range of products from inexpensive IEMs up to having a full DCS system and high-end tube amps available to audition. This allows you to explore many aspects of the headphone audio hobby in one room and actually try a number of headphones that were otherwise on the show floor with different gear. To that end, I tried a pair of FiiO Audio Monarch Mark IV IEMs, and in this case with the bass switch on. For tips, they provided a set of generic narrowbore ones, and I dialed up some Gotan Project. Parts of the soundstage are quite spacious from these IEMs. The tips may be boosting the bass though, given that they were narrowbore, although obviously the bass switch was on. However, the setup was good enough that the bass didn't interfere with the mid-range or treble. Percussion sounded good through these IEMs, but the phase may have been a bit odd due to the uneven tuning. I wish now that I had tried them with the bass switch off. The mid-range was generally quite good, as well as the treble, although the latter was a bit tizzy, something that may have been rectifiable given that I was using generic tips, and there are other tips that can do better with this. Listening to Sarah Kay, I appreciated the deep low bass and sparkly vocals. However, the sound with the bass switch on was a bit overly dramatic, and I didn't feel it was totally natural. I did notice some IEMs had something of a dramatic sound signature that may be appealing during listening at the show, but may not be overall enjoyable during ownership, so that's something I might consider if I was reviewing these. I then tried Noble Audio's new flagship, the Kronos. Once again, with generic narrow bore tips, I listened to Sarah Kay. I found their sound overall to be nicely balanced, with the subtlety of the vocals very apparent. Switching to the Gotan Project's Triptycho, I felt the sound was a bit V-shaped, with a bit too much bass and a splashy and tizzy treble. This may have been the result, once again, of using just generic tips, and may have been better with a different setup than the Hugo 2 I listened from. However, they are very capable IEMs, and I think, like a lot of high-end IEMs, set up right could be very enjoyable to use. One of the surprise companies that has transformed themselves in the past year or so is Fosi Audio, going from making generic looking components on Amazon and eBay to creating their own unique design and some very unique products. At CanJam they showed their latest entry both in the IEM world and the headphone world in the form of the Fosi Audio X IEMs. At $99 they seem quite good value, with quite a clear if somewhat narrow soundstage, but good separation when listening to, say, I Am a Man of Constant Sorrow by the Soggy Bottom Boys. There was near no harshness or sibilance from this fairly neutrally tuned pair of IEMs. And with Dead Can Dance's Indus, there was surprisingly good bass, not too strong, maintaining a good soundstage, and the mid-range or treble were surprisingly clear considering their price. While they did not present the music in a way that was super nuanced in the mid-range or treble, they were without any significant faults. They also had their i5 planar headphones available for audition, not just at that table, but they were available in some of the other rooms. They were quite smooth and electrostat-like when listening to music such as Hank Jones. There was not so much bass with music such as Dead Can Dance, but a surprising amount of detail from the drums. Raikuda's La Luna, which I listened to before, was quite clear with a reasonable amount of mid-bass. Zach Maybach from ZMF, as always, had a whole room chock full of absolutely gorgeous headphones and amplification to go with it. I currently have a set of Calderas as well as a set of Atriums in for review, and I have been enjoying listening with them immensely. With more of a lively and musical instrument-like presentation, they make for something uniquely different in the headphone world. Quite a few people will happily wait for their ideal wood or choose an exotic design for their headphones, and then use the range of ear pads that ZMF makes, as well as cables, for fine-tuning their headphones for their system. Since they also have a tube amp to go with their headphones, you can get near a complete system, which will give you a very enjoyable listening experience. Naturally, the highlight of the show was the new Ori 3.0, which is based on one of their classic models. Not unlike the Caldera, they have a fun and energetic sound, which I think will be quite popular. AUNE has a range of headphones, the best of which is the upcoming AR9000s. I switched to listening to the Cowboy Junkies for listening with these headphones, and the Cowboy Junkies itself has tracks which are rather sibilant, and not surprisingly that came through clearly through the AR9000s. As the AUNE table was on the show floor, it was difficult to hear clearly with a pair of headphones that are very much open, but what I heard was pleasantly spacious sounding, and Dead Can Dance was pleasantly airy while having a maybe not particularly strong rumble, given that the Indus track generally works well with headphones that can deliver strong rumble, but it did suggest a more neutral or somewhat bass-like tuning. However, the vocals were very engaging despite all the background noise in the main ballroom. Jean-Pierre Mars' Prelude had a suitably strong bass, and that track does have suitably strong bass to begin with, but it showed that these headphones were capable of good bass where it exists and is present in the track. Switching to something different, I'll Take Care of You, sung by Beth Hart and Joe Bonamassa, sounded powerful through these headphones with vocals and a mid-range coming through strong and clear. To challenge these headphones a bit more, I put on some Spoon, which came through quite well, although I wasn't 100% sure about the frequency response between the mid-range and treble, something I'd have to evaluate in the future if I get these headphones in for review. When we think of final and headphones, we think of the D8000 series, which are certainly up there in price, but they had a new model on display. The DX3000 is going to be sold for only around $500. Now, initially looking at the earpads when I saw them, the smaller than average space for your ears made me concerned that these would sound congested. However, I was wrong. Now, while they are quite bassy, they do have a very good mid-range and treble quality, such that I suggested to Final that they offer the headphones with an alternate set of earpads that reduces the bass, preserving the good quality mid-range and treble for people who would like that tuning instead. In the IEM side of things, the A10000 IEMs were of different interest to me because I have the A8000. Now, being a bit less bright and a bit less V-shaped than the A8000, Dead Can Dance was still a little bit bright for preference, but the bass detail was very good. Vocals were wonderful, and with my direct to DSD from tape version of Infant Eyes, that jazz track had very nice timbre. Switching things up, Spoon was punchy, but of course with such a bright track the percussion was a bit tizzy, which was not much of a surprise for a single dynamic driver pair of IEMs. It will be interesting to try them with different tips to see if the tizziness could be reduced for rock music and the like.
Hey, I'm Richard from APOS, and we just make products that we want to bring smiles to people's faces. And we are generally music lovers, and we think that in order to enjoy music really well, we want to make it as accessible as possible for people to have good gear so that they can hear all the good parts about music. And so these are some of the things that we've been working on as a company. We built this tube amp, which is a vacuum tube amp. It's in an open case design, so you can kind of really appreciate the engineering and the tech behind it, especially obviously the vacuum tubes itself, which are a beautiful piece of what makes it sound so good. And we also here have a R2R DAC. It's an upcoming product. R2R, it's an older technology for how to convert digital signals that you find from your phone into the analog signals, which powers, for example, in the amp. We also have an amp here, which is we work with Geshelli. They're a wonderful team. We love them. And it's another DAC, which is using the more modern chip technology as well. And in terms of general, we had these products in a way where you can kind of see what's going on, and also at a price point where we want to bring more people into this hobby and into the ability to be able to have them affordable. So reality is we could have priced all these much higher, but we wanted to make it so that as much as possible, our philosophy as a company is to make things easy for people to get into here and enjoy good music. And so, yeah. And so, for example, this is $120. This is going to be less than $150. The Geshelli DAC is $195. And these are products that we ourselves would buy and we ourselves would enjoy because that's our philosophy.
Grado had a prototype headphone on display, which I didn't get around to listening to, as a lot of people were listening with it. But I did try the HP100 SEs again, especially given the last time I tried them it was on the show floor of CanJam New York, and this time they had a dedicated room. They were pairing them with gear from Geshelli Labs, which I thought was very appropriate given these headphones are easy to drive and the small tube sets from Geshelli are probably going to be a good match. Now, listening to Tonight by Dave Brubeck, they have a bright and open sound typical of the Grados, which have larger pads on them, and works well with music such as jazz. Likewise, when listening to Infant Eyes, the result was much the same, a very good and enjoyable match. However, music such as Dead Can Dance is a bit weak in the bass from these headphones, although that can be rectified, of course, by switching to, say, the flat pads. But the open sound, which is a touch bright overall with the larger G-cushion pads, becomes quite exciting and something that Grado headphones are known for. Notably, turning up the volume, they manage not to become harsh, and even music such as Spoon survives without becoming too overbearing listening with such a setup. As typical with Grado headphones, there is some mid-range glare, and however it is readily possible again to switch to the smaller cushions or the flat pads for a intimate and less bright sound. The $8,000 RAAL Imanis were available from so many different amplifiers at the show that you could try them under a number of different setups, some with the adapter, but more significantly, some newer high-end amplifiers have the adapter built in, making for a one-device setup for these ribbon headphones. One of the ones I was keen to try was Wu Audio's new WA33 Elite Edition, which is one such amp with a dedicated RAAL output. Listening with Jose Gonzalez Slow Moves, that came through with a mix of speed and effortless detail unlike anything I've heard except maybe from Electrostats. Like other Wu Audio amps, the tuning was quite warm, especially through the mid-range and mid-bass, and despite that, the detail was readily apparent. This was very noticeable at parts of the music such as where Jose is whispering. I wasn't the only person who was left highly impressed by the setup, and I have at least one friend who is intending to save money to buy that set. Interestingly, while I was in the Wu Audio room, a man had bought his own pair of legendary Sony MDR-R10s to try on one of the Wu Audio anniversary amplifiers. As well, another person bought their own AKG K1000s, also a legendary pair of ear speakers, to try in the head amp room on the Head Amp CFA3. It was very interesting to see people bring not just new headphones, but old and vintage models to try out. The one pair of in-ear monitors that transformed the industry a decade ago was the Campfire Audio Andromeda. For some years they were the gold standard of what an IEM should be, and while the IEM world has moved on in dramatic ways, especially in the last 5 years, nothing has quite singularly captured the IEM world as these IEMs did. Now, with the 10th anniversary of the Andromedas, they still only use balanced armature drivers, and that meant, say, Dead Can Dance has amazing space and the percussion is quite good. The tuning is classical Andromeda with spoon showing a warm tilt and great impact if having a slightly woolly bass compared to IEMs that use dynamic drivers. There was also a little bit of sibilance, but this may be readily resolved with other tips, and I often use tips such as spiral dots with them. A track I often use for testing bass is Del Grez's Lan Me La. This track used to sound really fantastic with the old Campfire Audio Atlas and Vega, which had the old super V-shaped tuning and had the most thunderous bass. Now, however, that track did sound slightly sibilant in the treble through the Andromedas and didn't have quite as much bass as some of the old classics, but still was very entertaining. Dire Straits' Once Upon a Time in the West is really great for the IEMs and is where the Andromeda really shines. However, there was still a touch of sibilance in the treble and the cymbals weren't quite perfect, again something which other tips may fix. Overall though, the latest Andromeda are an upgraded version of the old classic, peak balanced armature performance and entertaining overall. HiFiMan had their new range of unveiled models available at the show, as well as some newer lower end models such as the Edition VX and HE600. For more about these headphones, check out my reviews of the Aria Unveiled, HE1000 Unveiled and Susvara Unveiled. As always, they have their full range of headphones and IEMs available, including the unusual Isvanas, which has a built-in subwoofer. Of course, once again, I'd like to thank HiFiMan for sponsoring my show report. Quite a few people were lining up to hear the new Meze Poet headphones, which I reviewed just before CanJam New York. If you haven't already seen my review of those, do check it out. And once again, I'd like to thank Meze for sponsoring this show report. Chord had their range of products on display as usual, and for fun, Rob Watts connected the Hugo 2 up to the MScaler. So if you wanted to find out what a Hugo 2 sounds like with and without the MScaler connected, you could have done so at the show. FiiO had a number of new items available. One I wanted to check out was the giant M27, the successor to the M17. Now, listening with the Stealth headphones to La Luna by Raikuda, the M27 had a smooth and a bit of a mellow and somewhat easy to listen to sound, which I found very pleasing. An interesting amp at the show was the AUDMA HPA1. Including both a high power amplifier as well as a DAC, it has the unique feature where it is possible for you to change both the space around the music and the angle. The format of this space function is somewhat like a reverse crossfeed, allowing you to make the sound more spacious. The latter, of course, I presume affects the phase of the music, and I didn't notice a significant difference with the headphones I tried. With a pair of Valkyria titanium headphones, which are worth about $12,000, the effect worked quite well, expanding the soundstage, but it didn't work so well with the pair of DCA Stealth headphones I brought along with me. Actually, of that, the Valkyria Titanium are an interesting pair of headphones at $12,000. The very warm and punchy sound signature was quite fun to listen to music with. However, with a lack of detail, the sound quality made me feel like they'd accidentally added one too many zeros to the price. Fostex had their new TH919 headphones at the show. With a more neutral sound, music such as Dead Can Dance came through with less bass than what I was used to hearing from their closed back headphones. I felt in the end that they had a slight U-shape to the sound with still the deep rumbling bass that their dynamic driver headphones are used to delivering. But the treble, for example, was typical for a dynamic driver, lacking the finest detail, but otherwise the sound was fairly spacious. I did notice good instrument timbre with a good amount of detail from, say, music such as Hat and Beard when I was listening to it. However, at $27.99, that price competes with a lot of high-end planar headphones. I always get asked what I thought was the best of show, and two things distinctly come to mind. The first, of course, was the Woo audio setup with the WA33 Elite and the RAAL Imanis, which was absolutely amazing to listen to and behold. Now, I think if ever a system could possibly convince someone who thinks that high-end products are just not worth bothering with, playing a high-quality track through their regular headphones and then followed by this system, I don't think anybody could not notice the massive increase in detail and ease which the system delivers music. The second thing that impressed on me was that headphones around the $500 mark are starting to come very strongly into their own. In my mind, about 10 years ago, people would spend maybe $350 for a pair of high-end or pretty decent noise-cancelling headphones such as Sony and before Apple Bose. And at that price, headphones were basically okay, but nothing particularly special. However, with inflation and other factors, this is starting to go up, and having a bunch of $500 high-quality headphones that produce clearly good sound quality, as well as USB dongle DACs and even USB cable DACs, which are capable of producing decent sound, it will make it easier for people to enter the hobby at a price that seems comparable to what would cost a pair of less high quality sounding noise cancelling headphones for use at home. For the rest of us, of course, it means we can buy headphones which cost less but give us the kind of sound quality that we'd normally have to at least lay out 4 figures for, and not to mention have to lay out a lot more money for a suitable DAC and amp or DAC app combo to get the most out of them. Then of course, for people interested in in-ear monitors, if you don't need noise cancelling, it's surprising how far you can go with just $99. So did you go to CanJam lately or one of the CanJam shows? What kind of things did you notice and what kind of things are you interested in? Before I go, I'd like to thank all my patrons, caffeinators, and all the people who supported me in doing these show reports, such as HiFiMan, Bloom Audio, Schiit Audio, and Meze Audio, without whose support which I would not be able to do these reports.